So I think by now you should have a fairly good idea of how the proxy works. Now I'd like to build a little bit of an example of some things that we can do with proxies that may be a bit more useful than these arbitrary examples. So what we're going to implement is a subscribable API. What subscribable is going to do is it's going to accept a plain object as its argument, and it's going to return a subscribable object where we can subscribe to different operations that are taken on that object. What I want to be able to do is have a subscribe function on that object where I pass in an event name and a callback, and the event name could be add or set. Add is when we add a new property to the object, and set is when we mutate an existing property on that object. Now, whenever I trigger one of those events by mutating the object, I want those handlers, those callback functions that I passed in to subscribe, to fire. And I want them to receive some data about the object itself so I can decide if I want to trigger some other side effects or business logic. So we're going to declare a function named subscribable. It's going to be a factory function. It's going to take in an object. We'll say this is a record. And we'll keep it simple. We'll say property key and any. We're going to have our subscribers, which is going to be an object, and we'll have our add subscribers. For now, it's just going to be a function that does not return anything. We'll do the same thing for our set event. I think it'd be useful to have an enum for events. And I can't name it that because it is reserved. There we go. I'm going to change. And we're going to have our subscribe function. It's going to take an event, which is going to be a subscribe event, and we'll have our callback, which for now, just say void. And we'll go ahead and update the type signature for this in a moment. We're going to say if the event equals subscribe event.add. We're going to go ahead and add that to our subscribers. And if our event is set event, and we'll say else if, so that way we don't even have to bother checking this if we hit this condition. We're going to do the same thing here, but for the set subscribers, I suppose we could just say else not a valid event name. And then we need to create our proxy so we can return this object. We're setting subscribe on the object. Now, this is not how I would implement this if I were actually writing a library. In fact, I have written a library that uses this same kind of idea. There's a lot of edge cases and things that would need to be handled. This is a very naive implementation, but I just want you guys to see how quickly you can scaffold certain business logic such as this using proxies. So we're then going to go ahead and pass this object into the proxy, and then we need to implement our traps. We're going to go ahead and implement our set trap. Pass in these arguments. Make sure we return. And here we're going to handle logic for firing our subscribers. Now, how can we determine whether this is an add or a set? Well, we can use reflection. If we already have that property, we know that this is going to be a set event. Otherwise, we know it's an add event. And we're going to go ahead and run each of these. And I said I wanted to be able to pass metadata about the object. So we're going to say we'll pass target, property, and value. We're going to have to update the type signature for the callback. Let's go ahead and implement that here. We know it's a function that has no return value. So we'll say void. And we're going to need a generic type here. And since we know subscribable accepts a type record with the key property key in any value, we know T needs to extend this type. So we'll narrow it to that. We're going to say target, which is a type T. We have the property, which is going to be a key of T, potentially, and the value, which will be an any. And now we can go ahead and use this. I'm going to go ahead and implement this as a generic as well. That way we can reuse this throughout the function and pass it to callback. And we're going to actually need this to extend this record type. And we're missing an angle bracket. Now back to implementing the subscriber logic. We'll say otherwise subscribers.add, not for each. We're going to do the same thing here. So let's go ahead and try this out. So I'm going to have my object and we're going to have my subscribable object. And I'm going to change this to object.assign. And that's what we're going to return. And that way we have type inference that subscribe exists here. So let's try doing some subscriptions. And I also forgot to update the type signature for the callback here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this callback T type and also set that here. And now we should have our arguments. And for our callback, we're going to say console.log add subscription fired. And we'll pass in our arguments. We're going to copy this and do the same thing for set. Perfect. So now we're going to try mutating it a bit and doing some things. We're going to say message is going to equal goodbye. We're going to add a new property here. And we don't want TypeScript complaining about this, so we're going to say that our object be pretty much anything. I would not do this in a enterprise code base. And then we're going to say npx tsnode subscribable, because I don't have an actual package.json or tsconfig in here. We're just going to do this. And we see that our subscriptions have fired because we have accessed these properties. And you'll see if I comment them out, we're not going to get anything logged to the console. Now I want to show you an edge case with proxies. What happens if I have a nested object? So instead of just name, I would say full name, first Matthew, and then last Zito. And I'm going to change this real quick because it's kind of annoying that it keeps thinking it's the subscribable function. And we're just going to name this O. So I'm going to say o.name.first equals my username on GitHub. And I'm going to go ahead and comment these out so we can see what happens. Interesting. Nothing happened. No event fired. Why is that? Well, that's because name is also an object. If we look at the original object, name is an object with two properties, first and last, both string literals. And the problem is name itself is not a proxy. Obj is being proxied, but name is not being proxied. That means that when we go through these traps, they're going to trigger for anything that is shallow on that object, but not any of these nested fields. So how can we handle that? Well, there's a very common pattern that you'll see with proxies to handle this. And you'll see me talk about this in my Vue reactivity source code review, where you sort of recursively set nested properties to be proxies. And so what we're going to do is we're going to check that if the value of this property on this object is also an object, we're going to return a new proxy instead of just returning that value. We're going to return that value as yet another proxy, and we're going to pass in these same exact handlers so that way it is treated in the same way as any top level property on that object. So we will have deep reactivity. So I'm going to do a very basic check here. Reflect.get. We're going to pass in these three arguments. So we get the value. We're going to say if the type of value is an object and value is not null, we're going to return a new proxy. We'll pass obj, and we're going to need the handlers. And so what I'm going to do is to be able to reference these. I'm going to rip these out. Let's say handlers. And then we'll go ahead and pass in handlers here. And we'll also pass them in here. And then of course, I still need to return the value otherwise. We're going to see if this works now. I see. So we have lost type inference because of extracting those handlers. TypeScript compiler is not able to determine that these are proxy handlers. In fact, we could probably just grab the type from the proxy. So let's see what that is. Proxy constructor, proxy handler of type T. That's precisely what we're going to say handlers is. And now we get type inference back. Let's go ahead and try that again. And we see now it worked. Our ad subscription has now worked because we are returning a new proxy from the get trap if that value is an object. So that's it for ES6 proxies. You probably now have a pretty good idea of how proxies work and just how incredibly powerful they can be. They allow you to intercept getters and setters and all sorts of other operations that happen internally when you are manipulating an object, and you have the opportunity to handle those yourself, perform certain side effects. There are entire libraries and frameworks built on these things. If you're interested in seeing one such library, go check out my Vue reactivity source code review. I'll drop a link down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please give me a like, subscribe, comment on the video, let me know what you thought of proxies, and we'll see you guys next time.